What happened between Bruce Lee and Jim Kelly on the set of Enter the Dragon was never meant to leave that soundstage. But when one punch landed for real, the entire film crew stopped breathing. "Keep it tight, Jim." Bruce Lee said it quietly off camera between setups, and Jim Kelly nodded. The way a man nods when he's already decided he isn't going to keep it tight. On the back lot of Golden Harvest Studios outside Kowloon in February 1973, the production of Enter the Dragon was 11 days into principal photography. The heat inside the sound stage sat somewhere past 90 degrees with no real air flow. The lights overhead adding their own weight to the air, and the whole crew had been on a 6-day stretch without a break. Word had been moving through the unit for 2 days that something was building between two of the leads. And that afternoon on the courtyard set built to look like an outdoor training yard, it finally surfaced. I want to back up 9 days because nothing about what happened on day 11 makes sense without it. Bruce Lee was both the star and in every way that mattered on that set, the actual director of the fight work. Robert Klaus had the title, but everybody on that crew, every grip, every electrician, every assistant director knew that when it came to the fighting, Bruce called it. He had built every sequence himself, choreographed every beat down to the inch, and he expected the people performing those beats to hit their marks the way a conductor expects an orchestra to hit a note. Not close, exact. Jim Kelly had come on to the production with a real reputation of his own. He held a black belt in karate, had won the middleweight and grand champion titles at the Long Beach International Karate Championships 2 years running, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from having actually beaten real opponents in real competition under real rules. He wasn't an actor pretending to know martial arts. He was a fighter who happened to also be acting now. And there's a meaningful difference between those two things. A difference that became the whole engine of what happened between him and Bruce. The first few days of rehearsal went fine. Jim hit his marks. Bruce adjusted some of the choreography to fit Jim's actual strengths rather than forcing him into something unnatural, and the early footage looked clean. I remember thinking, watching from behind the lighting rig, that these two men respected each other, and for a while, I think they did. The trouble started on day 4 during a break between setups when one of the stunt coordinators made an offhand comment to a few crew members about how precise Bruce's control was, how he could stop a strike an inch from contact, and the audience would never know the difference. It wasn't said to start anything. It was said the way crew members talk about a star's skill when they're impressed by it, which happens on every set all the time. Jim was sitting close enough to hear it. He didn't say anything in the moment, but later that day during lunch, sitting with 2 of the supporting actors near catering, he said something that got repeated to me within the hour by one of the camera assistants. He said that point karate looked impressive to people who'd never actually fought, but that real karate, full contact karate, the kind he trained and competed in, didn't rely on stopping an inch short of anything. He said real fighters finished what they started. It wasn't aimed at Bruce directly, not in the words, but everybody at that table knew exactly who he was talking about, and within an hour, so did half the crew. I didn't think much of it at the time. Actors talk on sets. Egos exist on sets. You hear this kind of thing constantly, and most of it evaporates by the next morning. I figured this would too. On day 5, during the choreography session for the courtyard sequence, Jim pushed the pace on 2 of the strikes. Not dangerously. Nothing that would have alarmed anyone watching casually, just slightly faster and slightly harder than the half-speed mark the rehearsal called for. Bruce caught it immediately. The way he caught everything, and he stopped the take. He didn't raise his voice. I want to be clear about that because people sometimes imagine confrontations on movie sets as loud dramatic things, and this wasn't that. Not yet. Bruce simply said, "Half speed, Jim. We're building the rhythm first. Power comes later in the edit." Jim nodded, said, "Sure." And they ran it again, slower this time. But it happened again on day 6 and again on day 7. A little more each time. A slow creep upward that anyone who's worked enough productions recognizes as a kind of testing. Jim wasn't trying to hurt anyone yet. I don't believe that. What I believe, having watched it build day by day from 20 feet away, is that Jim Kelly had real skill and real pride in that skill. And some part of him couldn't fully accept that the choreography required him to hold back against a man who on paper weighed maybe 145 pounds soaking wet. Bob Wall, who was also on that production and who knew Bruce well from years of training together, told me later that he'd had a conversation with Bruce about it around day 7. He said Bruce had mentioned Jim was pushing and Bob asked if he wanted him to step in. Bruce told him no. He said Jim would either find his own discipline or he wouldn't. And either way, Bruce would handle it when it needed handling. That's the part people don't understand about Bruce Lee on a film set. He wasn't a man who escalated things quickly. He was a man who watched patiently and let situations develop until the moment when addressing them directly became the only useful option. He'd done the same thing with other people over the years. According to Bob, men who tested him in gyms or at demonstrations. He gave them room. He just didn't give them forever. On day 8, the production took a half day for equipment issues with one of the cameras. And during that downtime, Jim made another comment. This one bigger than the lunch table remark from a few days earlier. He was talking with a couple of the Hong Kong stunt performers near the equipment trucks. And one of them, a young guy who barely spoke English, but understood enough to repeat what he heard, later told one of the translators what Jim had said. Jim had said that Bruce's whole style was built around looking fast on camera, that real combat didn't work the way it looked in these choreographed sequences, and that if the cameras weren't rolling and it was just 2 men in a room, things would look very different. That comment made its way back to Bruce by that evening. I don't know exactly who told him, maybe Bob, maybe one of the translators, maybe one of the crew who'd been standing close enough to hear it directly. What I know is that the next morning, day 9, Bruce arrived on set earlier than usual and spent 20 minutes alone in the courtyard space before anyone else showed up, just standing there looking at the set the way he sometimes did before a big sequence. If you think the lunch table comment was the moment that set everything in motion, what happened 2 days later will make that look like nothing. Day 11. The sequence being shot that day was the one where Jim's character squares off against a group of guards in the courtyard with Bruce's character watching from a distance before the wider confrontation. But before they got to the wide shots, there was a smaller insert sequence planned. A brief moment of contact between Bruce and Jim's characters that had been added late in pre-production. A quick exchange meant to establish tension between them before the larger plot moved forward. It was 4 beats. A jab from Jim, a slipped counter from Bruce, a return strike from Jim that Bruce was supposed to catch on his forearm, and a final exchange where both men would break apart, half speed throughout. Clean, simple, the kind of sequence that should have taken maybe 45 minutes to nail across a few takes. The first take went fine. Slightly stiff, but fine. Claus wanted another for coverage. The second take is where it happened. Jim threw the jab at full speed. Not a small increase like the ones from the previous week. Full speed, full extension, thrown with the same commitment he'd have used in an actual competition ring. Bruce read it and slipped it by maybe 4 inches. The kind of margin that looked effortless on camera, but required real precision to execute against a strike thrown that fast without warning. Klaus, watching the monitor, didn't call cut immediately. He'd seen enough fight choreography over the years to recognize when something had shifted, but not enough martial arts specifically to know exactly what he was looking at. He hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, which in retrospect was exactly the wrong 2 seconds because in that window, Jim threw the second beat. The counter-strike, the one that was supposed to land on Bruce's forearm in a controlled block, came in fast and committed, aimed not at the forearm exactly, but slightly higher toward the shoulder and the edge of the jaw. It connected. Not a full power shot, not enough to seriously hurt a trained fighter, but real contact, the kind that makes a sound and makes a crowd go quiet. Bruce's head snapped slightly to the side. The sound stage, which had been buzzing with the low hum of equipment and crew movement a moment before, went completely silent. Bruce didn't go down. He didn't even stumble. He absorbed it, took half a step to reset his footing, and looked at Jim Kelly across the 8 feet of space between them. Klaus finally called cut. For a few seconds, nobody moved. I was standing near the lighting rig with a clear line to both men. And what I remember most clearly is the silence. 40 maybe 50 crew members on that sound stage and not one of them made a sound. Jim said something into the quiet that I heard clearly because I was close enough. He said, "My bad. Got caught up in it." It wasn't delivered as a real apology. There was something underneath it, a kind of satisfaction that he tried to keep off his face and mostly succeeded, except around the eyes where it showed. Anyway, Bruce rolled his shoulder once, testing it, his expression giving away almost nothing. He looked at Jim for a long moment. Then he said, calm and even again, "Same beat." Klaus, sensing something he didn't fully understand but knew enough to respect, called for the cameras to reset. If you think Jim apologizing and Bruce calling for another take was the end of it, what happened in the next take is the part nobody who wasn't standing where I was standing has ever heard described accurately. The cameras rolled again. Jim threw the jab, this time even faster than the first one. Like he decided that since the first hit had landed clean and gotten away with looking like an accident, he might as well commit fully to a second. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe it. And I've replayed it in my head more times over the past 50 years than almost any other thing I witnessed in this business. Bruce was not where the jab was aimed. He had shifted not backward, but at an angle, the kind of small lateral movement that looks like nothing until you understand that it puts the puncher's whole committed weight in exactly the wrong place to recover quickly. The jab passed through empty air, and before Jim's arm had even fully retracted, Bruce's hand connected with Jim's chest, an open palm strike delivered from close range with enough precision and speed that the sound of it carried across the entire sound stage. Jim staggered back 2 full steps. Not a knockdown, not dramatic, but real, visible. The kind of stagger that happens when a strike lands somewhere your body wasn't braced for. The 40 or 50 people watching made a collective sound. Something between a gasp and an intake of breath. The sound a room makes when it has just watched something it wasn't sure was actually going to happen. Jim's face went through several things very quickly. Surprise first, genuine and unguarded. Then something harder underneath it. The look of a proud, accomplished fighter who had just been hit clean in front of an entire film crew by a man nearly 100 pounds lighter than him. He didn't say anything right away. He reset his stance. The real stance now, not the choreographed mark, the stance of a man who fights for real. And Klaus, watching all of this from behind the camera, had the presence of mind to keep the cameras rolling rather than calling cut. Because whatever he understood or didn't understand about martial arts, he understood that something significant was unfolding in front of his lens. Jim came forward again, this time with a combination, not a single strike, but a real sequence, the kind he'd have thrown in actual competition. A jab to set distance, followed by a cross, aimed to actually connect. The jab found nothing again. Bruce, having already adjusted his position before the punch was even fully thrown. The cross followed immediately behind it. Full power, full commitment, the kind of punch that had likely ended fights for Jim in real tournaments. It never landed. Bruce slipped inside the arc of it, close enough that the punch had nowhere to generate force. And from that position, too close for Jim's reach advantage to mean anything. Bruce's hands moved fast. 2 compact strikes, one to the ribs and one to the shoulder, delivered in roughly half a second. The kind of speed that the human eye struggles to fully track in the moment and only makes sense afterward, replaying it in memory. Jim's balance broke. Not a clean knockdown, but he went down on one knee, catching himself with one hand against the courtyard set's wooden flooring, his breathing suddenly audible across the quiet stage. Klaus called cut finally, his voice carrying an edge of genuine alarm now rather than professional patience. Jim stayed on one knee for a moment, his chest rising and falling, and the expression on his face in that pause is something I've thought about more than almost anything else from that production. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the look of a man encountering information about the world that didn't fit anywhere in his existing understanding of it. He pushed himself up slowly. He looked at Bruce, who was standing a few feet away, hands at his sides, breathing normally, his expression unreadable in the way it always was in moments like this. Bob Wall had moved closer during the second exchange, close enough to step in if things escalated further. And he told me afterward that he'd been ready to physically separate them if it came to that. It didn't come to that. Not because either man backed down exactly, but because something passed between them in that pause that diffused whatever was about to happen next. Jim said, "You held back." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation and an observation at the same time, the voice of a man trying to reconcile what he just felt with the assumptions he'd walked onto that set carrying. Bruce said, "Yes." Jim said, "Why?" Bruce said, "Because we're making a film, not settling something. If I hadn't held back, you wouldn't be standing right now." The silence on that sound stage after he said it was the loudest silence I've ever experienced in my career. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered to the person next to them. 40 or 50 professionals who had collectively seen everything this industry could produce stood there and didn't make a sound. Jim was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that I think surprised everyone listening, myself included. He said, "Show me again slower. I want to actually see what you did." It wasn't a challenge this time. The tone had completely shifted. There was something almost humble in it. The voice of a man who had just had a very specific and very physical lesson about the gap between what he believed about himself and what was actually true, and who was now, in the immediate aftermath of that lesson, genuinely curious rather than wounded. Bruce looked at him for a moment, the way he looked at people when he was deciding whether what they were asking for was real or performative. Then he nodded. He walked Jim through it right there on the set in front of the crew, slowing the same sequence down beat by beat. He showed him the angle of the lateral step. Explained how committing fully to a strike creates a window of vulnerability in the half-second after the strike misses before the body can fully recover its balance. He showed him where his weight had been wrong on the cross. How the punch had telegraphed itself through a slight shift in his shoulder before it ever left his arm. Jim listened. Really listened. The way you listen when something has just rearranged your understanding of your own skill set and you're trying to absorb the new shape of it as fast as possible. What happened over the next 20 minutes is the part of this story that almost nobody outside that soundstage has ever heard because it wasn't dramatic in the way the hit and the response had been. It was quiet Bruce showing Jim piece by piece not to humiliate him further but because Jim had asked genuinely to understand. At one point, Jim asked him directly, "Were you ever worried when I hit you?" Bruce thought about it for a second, the way he thought about most questions before answering them. He said, "No, I was annoyed." There's a difference. Jim laughed, a short surprised laugh, the tension in the room finally breaking just slightly. He said, "Fair enough." Klaus, watching all of this unfold, eventually stepped in and suggested they take a break before resetting. For the actual master shot. The choreographed version that would end up in the finished film. Everyone needed a minute. The crew dispersed slowly, the energy on that soundstage shifting from tension to something quieter and more complicated. The specific feeling that settles over a room after it has witnessed something nobody fully expected. I followed Bruce at a distance toward the equipment area near the back of the sound stage. Mostly because I had a legitimate reason to be there checking on lighting cables, but partly, I'll admit, because I wanted to see if anything else happened. Bob Wall was already there leaning against one of the crates, and the two of them spoke quietly enough that I had to stay close to actually catch it. Bob said, "You gave him room for 8 days." Bruce said, "He needed it." Bob said, "You could have ended it on day 5. Bruce said, "And ending it on day 5 would have made a point. It wouldn't have taught him anything. He needed to find out for himself what the gap actually was." Bob said, "And if he'd really hurt you on that second take?" Bruce was quiet for a moment. He said he couldn't. Not the way he was moving. I'd already read where he was going before he started. Bob looked at him for a long moment and then said something that I've never forgotten, mostly because of how simply he said it. He said, "You scare me sometimes." You know that? Bruce smiled slightly. The first real smile I'd seen on him in days. He said, "Good means you're paying attention." They reset about 30 minutes later, the actual master shot, choreographed, controlled, both men hitting every mark precisely, the version that would eventually make it into the final cut of the film. If you've ever watched that sequence in Enter the Dragon, you've seen the polished result. Two men moving through a tightly controlled exchange that looks clean and professional on screen. You have no idea watching it what happened twice before that final take-off camera in the gaps between setups in front of 40 or 50 witnesses who never spoke about it publicly for decades. What happened over the rest of the shoot is in some ways the more interesting part of the story. Even though it's quieter than the moment everybody who's heard rumors about this day usually wants to hear about. Jim Kelly's behavior on set changed completely after that afternoon. Not in a defeated way. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to tell this story as one where a proud man got humbled and slunk away. That's not what happened. Jim remained confident, remained himself, remained one of the most physically gifted people on that production. What changed was something quieter and I think more meaningful. He started actually watching Bruce work. Not performing respect for the cameras or the crew, but genuinely studying the way Bruce moved between setups, asking him questions during downtime that had nothing to do with the film. Questions about footwork, about timing, about how Bruce had developed the kind of read on an opponent's weight distribution that had let him slip 2 full-speed strikes from a trained competition fighter without ever needing to fully commit to blocking either one. Bruce, for his part, never brought up the incident again. Not once, as far as I ever heard, for the remaining 6 weeks of production. He treated Jim exactly the way he treated him before any of it happened, which I think was its own kind of statement, the kind that doesn't need words attached to it. There was one more moment near the end of the shoot that I think belongs in this story, even though it happened weeks later and had nothing directly to do with the incident itself. The production was wrapping the underground layer sequences. Late at night, the crew exhausted, everyone running on the particular fatigue that settles into a set near the end of a long shoot. Jim and Bruce were sitting near the catering table during a lighting setup, and I was close enough, refilling a coffee, to catch the tail end of a conversation. Im was saying something about how he'd spent years believing that real fighting and film fighting were two completely separate disciplines, and that nothing about one could really inform the other. Bruce said, "They're not separate. They're the same understanding. Expressed 2 different ways. The control I use to make a strike look real on camera is the same control I'd use to stop a strike from landing in a real fight. People think the difference is the violence. The difference is actually the intention behind the movement." Jim said, "I didn't believe that 9 days into this shoot." Bruce said, "I know. That's why I let you find out instead of telling you." Jim laughed that same short surprised laugh from weeks earlier. He said, "You really do that on purpose. Let people walk into it." Bruce said only when telling them wouldn't have worked. I think about that exchange more than almost anything else from that production, more even than the hit itself or the 2 strikes that answered it, because it tells you something true about who Bruce Lee actually was underneath the speed and the precision and the reputation. He wasn't a man looking for confrontation. He gave Jim 8 full days of room to find his own discipline before he ever had to step in and resolve it himself. And even when he did resolve it, he resolved it with exactly the minimum force necessary. 2 compact strikes and a conversation. Nothing more. Nothing performed for an audience. Nothing carried forward as a grudge. Enter the Dragon released in August of 1973, 26 days after Bruce Lee died. I remember sitting in a theater in Los Angeles, watching that courtyard sequence on screen, the polished choreographed version, knowing exactly what had actually happened in the gaps between those takes months earlier, and feeling like I was the only person in that theater who understood what they were really watching. Jim Kelly went on to a long career of his own, became a recognizable face in martial arts cinema for the rest of the decade and beyond. I never heard him talk publicly about that afternoon on the soundstage, not in any interview I came across over the years. And I looked more than once out of curiosity. I think like a lot of things that happen on film sets, it became something that belonged only to the people who were actually there, too specific and too personal to translate into a story for cameras and reporters. I worked on a handful more productions after Enter the Dragon before eventually moving into a different line of work entirely. But I never forgot that afternoon, the silence on that sound stage after the second exchange, the particular quality of 40 or 50 professionals collectively not making a sound. I've been in plenty of rooms since where something dramatic happened. None of them ever matched the specific weight of that one. What I remember most, more than the hit, more than the 2 strikes that answered it, is the quiet conversation by the equipment crates afterward and the one near the catering table weeks later. Because that's the part of the story that the legend leaves out. Everybody who's heard some fragment of this over the years focuses on the moment Jim Kelly hit Bruce Lee for real on a film set. Almost nobody focuses on the 8 days before it when Bruce watched a proud, talented man test him over and over and chose every single day not to answer it until the moment finally demanded it.